Radiant Energy 녹음 1차 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 청크 컷입니다.
If America's economy runs hot, what happens to the rest of the world?
If America's economy runs hot, what happens to the rest of the world?
When America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold.
When America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold.
But what happens when it runs a fever?
But what happens if it runs a fever?
After a trying 2020 in which GDP fell by 3.5%,
After a trying 2020 in which GDP fell by 3.5%,
America is poised to enjoy a robust rebound in 2021.
America is poised to enjoy a robust rebound in 2021
simply by returning to something like normal as vaccination proceeds.
simply by returning to something like normal as vaccination proceeds.
Yet it might manage more than just that.
Yet it might manage more than just that.
If President Joe Biden's COVID-19 relief bill is enacted,
If President Joe Biden's COVID-19 relief bill is enacted,
total stimulus this year may exceed $2.5 trillion.
total stimulus this year may exceed $2.5 trillion.
That could easily push output above
That could easily push output above
what the Congressional Budget Office estimates to be its potential level.
what the Congressional Budget Offices expects it to be its
That
potential
is,
level.
the amount the economy can produce. That is, the amount the economy can produce
That is the amount the economy can produce
without an increase in inflationary pressure.
without an increase in inflationary pressure.
This possibility, as some American economists
This possibility
On the
has
lookout
some
for
American
signs of
economists. This possibility has some
ability, as
American.
some American economists
This possibility has some American economists
on the lookout for signs of accelerating growth in prices and wages.
on the lookout for signs of accelerating growth in prices and wages.
America does not operate in a vacuum, however.
America does not operate in a vacuum, however.
Should overheating occur,
Should overheating occur,
its effects will not be confined within its borders.
its effects will not be confined within its borders.
Depending on how the recovery plays out,
Depending on how the recovery plays out,
a hot American economy could be a boon for the rest of the world,
a hot American economy could be a boon for the rest of the world,
or yet another source of concern.
or yet another source of concern.
In a closed economy that does not trade with the rest of the world,
In a closed economy that does not trade with the rest of the world,
too little spending leads to job losses and downward pressure on prices.
too little spending leads to downward pressure. 다시 듣겠습니다.
Spending leads to job losses and downward pressure on prices.
Too little spending leads to and downward price.
Whereas too much should push up employment and eventually prices.
Whereas too much would eventually push up prices and eventually wages.
In an open economy, however, some of the effects of the shifts in demand
In an open economy, however, some of the shifts of
In an open economy, however, some of the effects of the shifts in demand
In an open economy, however, some of the effects of the shifts in demand
spill over to the rest of the world.
spill over to the rest of the world.
A sharp drop in spending, for instance,
A sharp drop in spending, for instance,
may be associated with plunging demand for imports.
may be associated with plunging demands for import,
In which case some of the pain of a slump is exported abroad.
in which case some of the pain is exported abroad.
During the global financial crisis of 2007 to 9,
During the global financial crisis of 2007 to 9,
troubles in financial markets wreaked havoc all over the world.
Troubles in financial markets wreaked havoc all over the world.
But even countries relatively insulated from those woes
When even countries insulated from those woes
felt a chill thanks to trade links with America and Europe.
felt a chill thanks to trade links with America and Europe.
According to one estimate, about a quarter of the drop in American demand
According to one estimate, a quarter of drop in the American demand
and a fifth of the fall in European demand
and a fifth of fall in the European demand
was borne by other economies and transmitted through trade.
was borne by other economies and transmitted through trades.
A boost to demand ought to work in a similar way, but in the other direction.
A boost in demand ought to work in a similar way, but in the other direction.
As Americans spend more, some of it leaks abroad.
As America spends more, some of it leaks abroad.
Through purchases of foreign goods, for example,
Purchases for foreign goods, for example,
or spending on services, including tourism,
or spending on services, including tourism,
which should begin to rebound as pandemic restrictions are lifted.
which should begin to rebound as pandemic restrictions are lifted.
An analysis of fiscal policy spillovers
An analysis of fiscal
published
spillovers
by the IMF in 2017 found
managed by the IMF in 1997 found
that an American stimulus consisting mostly of spending as opposed to tax cuts
that American stimulus, mostly including of spending as opposed to tax cuts,
and worth 1% of GDP
and worth 1% of GDP,
raises the output of the average country by 0.33% in the first year. Country raises the output of the average country by 0.33% in the first year.
Raises the output of the average country by 0.33% in the first year.
Countries with closer trade ties experience bigger effects.
Countries with closer trade ties experience bigger effects.
The fillip to Canada's economy is estimated to be
The Phillips to Canada's economy is estimated to be
almost 3 times the average, for example.
almost 3 times the average, for example.
If the combination of reopening and stimulus
If the combination of reopening and stimulus
invigorates the American consumer, the effects could quickly be felt all over the world.
invigorates the American consumer, the effects will quickly be felt all over the world.
The
여기까지가
degree to which it is
필사였습니다.
The degree to which it is felt, however,
The degree to which it is felt, however,
depends crucially on the policy response both at home and abroad.
depends crucially on policy forms both at home and abroad.
Fiscal spillovers are more powerful
Fiscal spillovers are more powerful
when recipient countries are themselves operating below potential.
when recipient countries are themselves operating below potential.
American spending is thus more likely to spill over to the rest of the world
America's spending is therefore more likely to spill over to the rest of the world
if its recovery is much stronger than those of its trading partners.
if its recovery is much stronger than those of its trading partners.
Ordinarily, spillovers provide a strong incentive
Ordinarily, spillovers provide a strong incentive
for governments to coordinate their stimulus efforts, lest some tight-fisted economies, for example those in Europe,
lest some
for example those in lest some tight-fisted economies, for example those in Europe,
lest some tight-fisted economies, For example, like those in Europe.
Free ride on the largesse leaking from more generous ones.
Free ride on the largesse leaking from more weaker ones.
Indeed, on February 12th, Janet Yellen, America's Treasury Secretary,
Indeed, on February 12th, Janet Yellen, America's Treasury Secretary,
urged her counterparts in the G7 group of countries
among G7 countries
to go big on stimulus too.
To go big on stimulus too.
Countries that free ride could find themselves in hot water with Miss Yellen.
Countries that free ride might find themselves in hot water with Miss Yellen. The
Biden administration has promised to be stern with countries.
The Biden administration is promised to be stern with countries
that run large, persistent trade surpluses. That run large, persistent trade deficits. But if America does come close to overheating, then a reluctance to spend elsewhere may be less irksome than usual. As demand-starved countries serve as a release valve. For the pressure building up at home.
Being built up at home.
Growth in global trade seems to have enhanced its pressure-relieving capabilities.
Growth in global economy seems to enhance its pressure-relieving ability.
According to work by Jane Eyrig, Stephen Kamin, Deborah Lintner, and Jamie Marquez of the Federal Reserve.
According to a work by the Federal Reserve.
They reckon that the expansion in trade has served to weaken the link.
Will weaken the link
between changes in domestic demand and corresponding shifts in total output.
Between changes in domestic demands and corresponding in output.
With net exports bearing more of the burden.
And with exports bearing more of the burden.
Of adjustment to changes in domestic spending.
More adjustment to changes in domestic spending.
In the late 1990s, for instance, measures of domestic demand grew even faster.
In the late 1990s, measures in domestic demands even grew faster
than real GDP, which was itself growing at a rapid clip. Inflation remained relatively subdued, however,
Inflation remained relatively subdued, in part,
because America's current account deficit swelled. Similarly, a surge in imports this year might dissipate potential inflationary pressures in America. While giving a lift to its weaker trade partners. The biggest uncertainty about the global effects of a hot American economy.
The biggest concern of the impact of global economy over hot America is the reaction of the Fed.
Recent work by Kristen Forbes of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology suggests that domestic inflation has become more responsive over time to global factors.
Suggests that domestic reaction has become more sensitive over time.
That domestic inflation has become more responsive over time to global factors.
That domestic inflation has become more responsive to global economy over time,
including the amount of economic slack across the global economy as a whole.
Including the economic slack all over the world as a whole.
Yet wage inflation still seems to respond mostly to domestic conditions.
안 들립니다.
Yet wage inflation still seems to respond mostly to domestic conditions.
Yet wage inflation seems still likely to be reacting to domestic inflation.
The Fed might therefore shrug off price rises later this year.
The Fed might shrug off the price rises later this year,
Reckoning that short-run price pressures will not translate into sustained inflation.
reckoning that short-run price pressures will not turn into price pressures
Until America's job market and the world economy is fully recovered.
until the America's job market and the world economy is not fully recovered.
A dovish Fed should make for a weaker dollar
A dovish Fed should make for a weaker dollar
and easier financial conditions worldwide,
and easier financial conditions worldwide,
adding to the boost that comes from Americans buying more goods from abroad. Adding to the boost that comes from Americans buying more goods from abroad.
adding to the boost coming from the Americans and more goods from the rest of the world.
But a really rip-roaring economy could test the Fed's patience.
But a really rip-roaring economy can test the Fed's patience,
Particularly if a yawning current account deficit
particularly if a yawning current account deficit
and soaring asset prices
and the soaring asset prices
cause it to worry about a build-up of financial risk.
cause it to worry about the financial build-up.
The spectre of American interest rate hikes
The specter of American economy, America's,
interest rate hikes
the specter of America's inflation
could frighten global markets and force emerging economies
could frighten global markets and
force emerging economies
global economy
to adopt less stimulative fiscal and monetary policies.
to adopt less fiscal policies.
A bit of demand spilling over from America would seem insignificant in comparison.
A bit of demand spilling over from America's economy might seem.
That the Fed will suddenly turn hawkish still seems unlikely,
That the Fed will suddenly turn hawkish still seems unlikely,
but if America's temperature runs high enough,
but if America's economy temperature runs high enough, but if America's temperature runs high enough,
the rest of the world may break out in cold sweats.
the rest of the world might break out in cold sweats. 끝났습니다.